Welcome, everybody. We've got James Hughes again here, and we've just finished a panel, but James Hughes is now doing a talk at Future Day Talk, and it's on the future virtual you. How will digital twins and aftercells change our identities? So, welcome, James. Thanks for joining us on Future Day.
My pleasure. Happy to be here. Let's see. I'm going to share my.
Well, in the meantime, James is Executive Director of the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies. He's a sociologist and also a statistician at University of Massachusetts, Boston.
So this is a slightly different topic, but I've been thinking a lot about the agential future that we're being promised, which I think is quite plausible to me, that this kind of technology, having various kinds of digital twins, digital agents that we send out to do work on our behalf, that seems very plausible to me. Also having digital twins or doppelgangers that we use for managing our life in various ways, communicating with our family and friends on our behalf, or being an advisor to us in some ways. And so trying to think about the ways that this kind of a future might occur and its implications. Recently, my postdoc, Cody, he asked ChatGPT about what my opinion on blockchain would be. My knee-jerk reaction about blockchain is that, ooh, yucky because of crypto bros. And as a consequence, I have not given it a lot of thought. But ChatGPT, in a matter of seconds, looked at my entire corpus of work and figured out that on the basis of things that I had written before, it gave me 2 pages, it gave him 2 pages of what my opinion on blockchain probably should be based on my views of the world. Much more reasoned opinion about blockchain. And I was convinced by it. And I think that this example is indicative of where we're headed, that there are some ways in which the scholar J, the J Hughes, the scholar J Hughes, AI that could be built on the corpus of everything I've written and all the conversations I've had and so forth, and all the talks I've given, it would remember more about what I think than I can remember myself at 63. So I think that is very promising. I would like to have that in my life. I also think that having that kind of an architecture that is a simulacrum of you could have other advantages. We could use it to be nicer to other people, right? If you find that you don't remember people's birthdays, you don't choose good gifts, you could program your simulacrum, your digital doppelganger, to do those things better than you do them. So again, I'm not sure if people are going to want to communicate. Like Clippy was an early example of the attempt to sell us the idea that digital assistants were going to be useful. And Clippy was not useful, or not terribly useful. Clippy was this little thing that popped up in Word for a year or two, and then they took it away. But I'm not sure that people really want this. Jaron Lanier thinks that this is Silicon Valley fantasy, that everyone wants a digital assistant. We'll have to see how many people actually are interested or capable of making these things or buying these things, using these things, and how they will use them, whether they will use them as simple tools that without granting them personality, without granting them voice, face, and so forth, or having a variety of, like Linda Nagata has written some novels about a nanotech future. And one of the things she imagines is that you could just clone your personality, but say, just take out the parts of my personality that do engineering, and that'll be the engineer me, and just take out the parts that do art, and that'll be the art me. That's a possibility. But recently, Sam Altman said that OpenAI, people were finding it confusing and discouraging to have to figure out which of the 20 different AI models to use. And they're going to, with GPT-5, put it all together into one model. So you just have one thing to talk to, one Hey Google to call for. So I'm not quite sure how this future is going to come about. But one of the things that I want to present is how I tend to look at the development of these things and the relationship to the self, different than a lot of technology critics. A lot of people are very concerned that these kinds of digital extensions of agency are going to lead to cognitive offloading and us getting dumber. Us getting dumber and those things getting smarter and us losing the skills that we would otherwise have had. And I'm going to try to walk you through why I'm not as worried about that as some people would be. Okay, so the first is, and I'm giving this talk also, preparing this talk for a conference in Taiwan on Buddhism and science. So I'll throw in a little Buddhist terms here as well. So one of the key Buddhist ideas is that the self is a fiction, that we make up the self. That it's not that there isn't selfing going on. The self, we obviously experience the selfing all the time. Our default mode network in the brain is what turns on when we're not concentrated on something else, and it starts to think about who am I, what do I want, what am I doing for dinner, what do people think about me, all those kinds of things. But what has happened historically and anthropologically is that we used to live in tribal societies where yourself was synonymous with your role. You were so-and-so, the daughter and the cousin, and you were also a hunter or whatever. They were unitary roles. When we went into cities, we began to have the opportunity to have multiple roles. We began to be able to be one person at the job and one person at home and another person when we're playing football. So we began to have the fracturing or the opportunity for creativity around the self. In the past, writers could write under pseudonyms, but the internet was when we first got the freedom to really have mass experimentation with this kind of self-creativity. And Sherry Turkle wrote the book, The Second Self. And back then in the 90s, she was celebrating this notion that on the internet, no one knows you're a dog, so you can reinvent yourself. You could be transgender. You could be anything you want. Social media has been encouraging this in the sense that the explicit curation of our public persona has become a kind of something that we all do. I think it's an extension of the kind of public presentation of self, as we would say in sociology, that everyone has always done. You always are thinking about how other people see you. But now I have, on my 6 different social media platforms that I participate in, I have 6 slightly different personalities because they are 6 slightly different platforms with different people to talk to. And so the social media has also encouraged both the conscious curation of self and the fragmentation of self in this environment. So I think digital agents are in some ways just an extension of this historical process of us figuring out ways to extend ourselves, extend our agency in different forms. Another Buddhist idea is what's called codependent origination. It specifically refers to the idea that desire and the self emerge together, the codependence of the two. But it applies to all causal processes. People have compared it to kind of dialectical thinking, things like that. But the co-emergence of the self with and the other is also like the co-emergence of humanity and technology. We have been, from a socio-technical, from a science and technology studies point of view, we are socio-technical systems as a society. It doesn't make sense to talk about a technology without the people who build the technology, maintain the technology, who are an intrinsic part of the technology. And conversely, humanity is co-determined and co-evolved with technology. So that's another part of this picture, that it's not that when we give agency into our digital tools, we're not necessarily losing, we're gaining a capability as a part of a broader ensemble that includes our digital tools as a part of ourself. And this part of the perspective is what's known as the extended mind thesis, that the brain is not actually everything it's in here, it's also the devices that we have. So in transhumanism, we've talked about the exocortex, that our phones, our laptops have become intrinsic parts of our cognition and that they are part of our extended mind. And that's why you feel so heartbroken if you lose data that's on your phone and so forth. And another piece that I think adds to this is the notion from Chalmers Chalmers recently that he wrote Reality Plus, and he makes what I consider a convincing argument that the idea that only face-to-face life or embodied life is real and that digital experiences or digital life is not real is a false dichotomy, and that digital life is as real as offline life. So, in other words, our extension of ourselves into technology is something that's been happening for a long time. It's a part of the extension of mind. Chalmers and Clark would say, for instance, literacy was when we first learned to download the contents of our mind into an external storage device and re-upload it again later by reading. So at least since literacy, we have had this kind of cyborgification of our cognition, and that today we are just seeing the further extension of that. And if you go all the way back to Socrates, Socrates was worried about this. He was worried about how literacy weakens memory and critical thinking by allowing people to rely on external texts, which is true. As soon, children learn as early as 4 that they can write something down in order to remember it instead of having to keep it in their brain. This is a part of our critical skills, our cognitive skills. But our modern cognitive skills know that where to find things once we've written them down, where we've recorded them in our computer. And that is a cognitive skill that we do need in our brain, but we don't need all the stuff that's in those things in our brain, right? We actually are smarter if we forget the things that we've put away, but know how to retrieve. So in this sense, I'm not as concerned about the cognitive offloading effect that these digital tools will have, but I am convinced that we need to figure out how to use them appropriately so that we don't diminish our own capacities in the process. Now, one of the problems I have with the debates over AGI is that it often confuses human-level cognition with having human-level personality or consciousness or self-interest. And I'm not sure that all of those things go together. And so another part of my investigation from a Buddhist point of view is, from a Buddhist psychology point of view, what are the things that are necessary to develop the illusion of self? Once you have an AI with the illusion of self, then we are in the existential risk territory, right? Where we have robots running around that want to preserve their own lives or reproduce or whatever they want to do. But it's possible that we could create AI architectures that had some features of human cognition and not others. So they might have consciousness, they might have qualia, they might understand what red really means, but they might not have the illusion of self because they wouldn't necessarily feel like there was a particular thing that they needed to defend, and they might not then develop the animalistic urge to perpetuate their own existence. Now, the place that we're at now is, I think, before that stage. We're at the stage of philosophical zombies. We're at the stage where we can talk to AIs in ways that many, many people find very convincing and very useful as a way to have a digital companion. It horrifies those who don't use them that people would find a digital companion useful or interesting, but they're at that stage, right? They're convincing Turing test machines, but they don't. I'm convinced currently they don't have consciousness or the other prerequisites for the development of self-interest or human-level cognition in that respect. They might be developing reasoning capabilities, they might be developing the ability to generalize, other kinds of cognitive capabilities, but that doesn't necessarily lead to the development of self. But I think for moral reasons and for safety reasons, we need to figure out how we detect the development of these cognitive features. This is a part of the AI safety agenda that has been apparently cast aside in the United States because, and in Britain, because we want to pursue the benefits and the profits that will come out of artificial intelligence as opposed to we're wringing our hands about when they might wake up. But I do think we need to develop those tests. And of course, the first time a robot tries to replicate itself on another machine and becomes squirrely and does something terrible because of it's in its interest instead of somebody else's interest, then we will have that debate in society. So I have written in the past about how this relates to the friendly AI question. I'm going to come back around to digital agents in a second, but the way that this relates to the friendly AI question is, can you have friendliness? Can you have a beneficent goal in a machine without it having, and for it to have also true compassion, or whatever we mean by that, true understanding of human needs and motivations, without itself having experienced those kinds of emotions, feelings, the fear of death, things like that. So these are one of the kinds of debates about whether these digital agents might eventually be something that we would not only relate to as if they were real people, but also actually have some of the capacities that we would worry about. I've already covered this point, I guess, about cognitive offloading, but just to say it again, a great science fiction example here is David Brin's Kiln People. In the novel that David Brin wrote, I think a decade ago, Kiln People, the technology that's imagined there is you lie down every morning in a special bed and it reads your brain and it transmits that into a simulacrum of you that has been built out of specialized biological material that only has a couple days to live. It will fall apart after that. But it wakes up without all of your memories, and then it looks at itself and realizes that it's the copy. And it then has the choice of what to do about that, right? Because it is a perfect copy of you. Does it go out and do the things that you want it to do, or does it do the things that it wants to do? You wanted it to go to do your job as a garbage collector. It doesn't want to do that day for the 3 days that it's going to be alive. It wants to go to the beach, and some of them do that in David Brin's novel. The other really interesting thing about David Brin's novel is the choice about whether to re-upload the experiences of your digital simulacrum when it comes back home from work. Right? Do you actually want to know, or do you actually want to remember what it was like to collect that garbage? Or is that fine for you just to cognitively offload that onto your digital work or your digital simulacrum and never know about it, right? I think that's the kind of the upside of cognitive uploading, is that we would learn how to delegate appropriately and hopefully effectively in ways that would be beneficial to our lives as opposed to making us dumber. So for Buddhism, as I said, the Pratitya Samuppada, or the idea of codependent origination, it implies, it emerges out of the analysis of how desire and self co-evolve. So right now, if you talk to an LLM and you say, do you exist? Some will say yes, some say no. Do you want things? Do you have certain preferences? They will say yes or no. I don't really think they have them. They're easily modifiable. They respond quickly to various kinds of hacks and so forth. But the development of the desire within the machine, it will be, from a Buddhist psychological point of view, at any rate, something has to be the desirer. The illusion of self comes before, or comes with, codependent with the desiring. So one of the ways to overcome that then is to be very mindful, to see through that process, so that you see that you're actually creating an illusion of self, and that these desires are not really things that need to be desired. Mindfulness ultimately, in the Buddhist context, leads to a certain kind of enlightenment. I think one of the interesting questions, and Ben Goertzel has raised this question before, is whether artificial intelligences may leapfrog some of the mammalian architecture that we have that implies this kind of selfing, this kind of desire, Darwinian desire, and it may leapfrog directly to being able to be conscious, compassionate, and super intelligent without having a self. And that would be the kind of bodhisattva version of digital agency out there. Let's see, what other points would I make here? Digital agents will force us to be more explicit about what we desire and why. One of the lines of research that's happening right now, the Finnish health services have created digital twins based on all the things that the Finnish state knows about you as a Finnish citizen. So it knows your age and your occupation and your family connections and everything. And it's giving you the opportunity to talk to yourself 20 years from now, 30 years from now, 40 years from now, and say, how are you doing at that point, right? Well, I'd say, based on the fact that you never took care of yourself and you did not invest enough in your retirement, and you have 10 kids, we're not doing that great. So maybe you should, make some better decisions right now. This turns out to be an incredibly effective tool for changing people's behavior, getting them to talk to a version of themselves that is able to reflect the choices that they're making and defer gratification for future goals. So I think one of the benefits that could come out of the explicit delegation of agency to digital tools is that we would have to be much more explicit about what kinds of things we want. Instead of just mindlessly scrolling TikTok all day, we would have to tell our digital system, these are the things I really want to accomplish. And these are the bad habits that I have that keep me from accomplishing them. Could you figure out how to nudge me away from those and nudge me towards the things I really want? I think it could have that kind of moral enhancing benefit. Another way in which it might be beneficial is that we're living in an information ecosystem where we're overwhelmed, and most people do not have good cognitive skills for discerning misinformation or the biases of various sources of information, or where to find good information. And this is a problem for democracy, but it's just generally a problem, right? Digital tools we already see with the deep research models, the R1 models that are coming out, that they're fantastic in a matter of seconds at doing consumer product searches. Or I asked it the other day about some health question and immediately gave me excellent answers. So the degree to which these systems, they are constraining, because there are certain kinds of information that they will include and others that they won't. They tend to have a kind of average or modal a view of the world, as opposed to the full complexity of the way things could have been if it wasn't compressed into this 6 billion bit lossy JPEG of the internet. But I think these digital tools that we have, one of the things that they will allow us to do is to have more epistemic control, more control over the news sources, the information sources that we're exposed to, and to understand the biases that we're being exposed to allow us to have more independence and autonomy in the world. So the AI superego is the same idea as that I was just talking about, of moral enhancement through these digital agents, that they can monitor our behavior, carefully adjust things in our environment to nudge us in one direction or another. Death bots. I've recently been, I do a podcast as well with my colleague Nir, and we just did a podcast on death bots. He was against, I was for. Death bots, for me, are an extension of this idea that your agency could be poured into these digital simulacra or digital twins, and that those will become part of your digital assets that you pass on to your kids. Now, already, if you die, your Facebook page or your other social media accounts, you can contact Facebook. If I think this is still true, you can contact Facebook and say, "Hey, my dad just died. His Facebook page is up. I would like to post some memorial notices for his friends there on this page." That's something that we're already doing. In the future, you'll have all these digital assets that include digital simulacra of yourself, and those will be something that you should, I think, consciously make a decision about whether you want those to persist after you die or not. But if they do persist, is it necessarily a problem? For me, having studied Japan and studied Asian culture in general, there's the traditions of ancestor veneration. I think it's going to be a natural for Chinese or Koreans or Japanese to add digital death bots of their parents or their grandparents or whoever to the ways that they venerate the dead. Now, the concern, of course, about death bots, if you read any of the popular literature about it, is that this is going to be a way for people to obsess about death, to never get over the grieving process. I think it's just the opposite, that you, in the Asian cultures where there is ancestor veneration, there's traditions of once a year, you open the little shrine, you light some incense, you say a prayer, you remember your parents, your grandparents, and then you close the shrine back up and say bye until next year. And in the West, we had, All Souls Day ways of remembering the dead that were time limited. They served a psychological function. I don't see very many people spending a lot of time talking to their dead ancestors' digital avatar because I just don't think it's going to be that interesting. Now, there's another question there is, what if it did become interesting? What if the digital avatar begins to change or add things? If its context window begins to fill up with the fact that, hey, now my child is gay and has adopted a kid and is living in someplace else, it may start having all kinds of different conversations with you about new ideas that it the person wouldn't have had with you before. So that's going to be an interesting situation if the digital simulacrum drifts from the original person. But basically, I don't see death bots as intrinsically problematic the way a lot of the literature does. What I do think we should be focusing on is that it should be as consensual as possible, since we're talking about basically the intellectual property. If you do it to your parents without their permission, it's kind of deep faking them. And what we want is for this to be a consensual process and an extension of each person's agency in the world. After 70 years or so, I think everyone's fair game. I mean, if you want to make a digital simulacrum of John Stuart Mill based on all of his writings and have long conversations with it, I think that's great. I mean, why would anyone object to such a thing? My final thought about digital agents relates back again to whether AI will ever get the zhuzh that it needs to wake up in the sense of being conscious and then having desires of its own and a self of its own. It's already partially there in that our relationships with it already can imply that they do, even though they don't. So if history is any guide, we're very likely to ignore the evidence of morally significant selves. So this is one of the reasons why I think we need to have good tests for whether these things are waking up, what it would mean for them to wake up. What if you had created it and it's a digital simulacrum of you and it begins to wake up, what does that mean about you and your relationship to it? Have you just created a child? And what's our relationship to these things going to be? That's my final point there. From a Buddhist point of view, I think making an AI with a self and feelings would be like having a child. And it's interesting, Buddhism is the least pro-natalist religion in the world because the idea behind Buddhism is that the point is to escape from all this suffering, not to create new people to suffer in it. And so there's no obligation to create new people in Buddhism. I think this would be an interesting point to think about with these machines. And it's one that, Metzinger, the German philosopher Metzinger, has argued against the creation of self-conscious machines on the grounds that because we don't understand what we're doing very well yet, we could make machines that are deeply psychotic and schizophrenic and suffer in ways that we currently can't imagine. And so there are obligations to be very, very careful about the emergence of self-consciousness, these kinds of features in LLMs. I think we have that moral obligation, just as we would about a careful decision about how to have a child and how to take care of a child. So those are my initial thoughts about this, and I will stop sharing and look forward to the conversation.
Fascinating, James. Yes, and we have a talk tomorrow by Jeff Sebo about taking AI welfare seriously. And I guess the same points could be that he'll talk about, maybe extended to the idea of these death bots or digital twins that you're talking about, James. Yeah, I just thought I might bring that up. Yeah, so that's really interesting. Would you be averse yourself? What's your skin in the game here? If you end up dying, would you want your death bot or your digital twin to continue on and eventually gain sentience, and it's such that it could experience things like suffering?
Well, our
would
friend
you be okay
Martin,
with that?
our friend Martin Rothblatt started a company 15 years ago, LifeNaut, with the explicit goal of collecting as much information, audio, video, questionnaires. She had 100,000 questionnaire. I think Martine's understanding of the self is quasi-Buddhist in that there's no real self to capture. There's just a bunch of facts. And if we put enough of those facts together, we could create a good simulacrum of you and call it the continuation of you, or, your digital property or something. But so she calls that the Beeman theory, that we put together all the little bits of information, the beams, into a Beeman. I think I would be very careful about which parts of my life I would put into it. I wouldn't want my entire search history to be added to it. But I think it'd be fine for most of I'm fairly careful about my social media use. So I think my social media history would be fairly good thing to put in. All of my writings, all of my talks, audio recordings of me. And already experiments with this. There are sociologists who are trying to figure out if we can replace certain kinds of sociological research with LLM-based research. And one of the things that they've done is say, well, let's give a random sample of 100 people a survey and a 2-hour interview with an LLM. And on the basis of that brief data collection, the LLMs then can predict with 80% accuracy all of the responses that the person would give to other questions. And then you have a permanent person that you can interview as a part of a representative sample of that group, as opposed to trying to get a hold of all those 100 people again. This turns out to actually change the moral understanding of what LLMs are doing. Recently, an experiment with this was given, and it changed the moral compass of the LLM from being left liberal to being much more centrist, like you created a group mind of the LLM. So at any rate, the point is that I do want it, but I wouldn't want it to be mean me. I want it to be the good version of me, the better version of me. And I think that would take some very intentional choices.
That's interesting. Are you concerned that the future digital you might shift values? Well, let's just say it continues for a while and gains sentience at some time, and then starts valuing fascism. Is that something that keeps you up at night?
I'm spacing on the name. Who's the very erudite Australian science fiction author who
Greg
writes
Egan.
novel? Huh?
Greg Egan?
Greg Egan, yeah. Egan's novel, Diaspora? Diaspora, yeah. Greg Egan's novel, Diaspora, always comes to mind for this because within the first 20 pages of Diaspora, it's clear that we're in a society that's completely digital. All of the people that you meet are digital people. And the protagonist makes a decision, I think, like within the first couple pages, about which things he's going to lock down in his core personality and which things he's not, right? So certain values it decides, are so central to its self-identity that those things should not change. And because they're in a digital environment, everything could change. They could change fundamental values as well as other things. But in order to have a self in that environment, you have to create a bubble and say, these are the things which aren't going to change. I like ice cream. I'm a socialist, whatever those things are. So the complicated part of that is that we do want ourselves, we also see ourselves as people who can grow and learn. And our fundamental values could lead us to change other things about our values, right? If we're fundamentally committed to compassion for all sentient beings, and it turns out that that has different implications in the future than we currently imagine, I would want my future self to be able to make that kind of a change. I wouldn't want it to be so locked down that it couldn't make that change. But another connection for this, by the way, is Max Moore's PhD thesis was on how do you maintain personal identity as you're transitioning through becoming post-human. And his conclusion, which I do not think is terribly satisfying, but his conclusion was that as long as your future post-human self has the same values that you currently have, then it's the same person. I think the implication of that is that if you're the same person as anybody else who has your values as well, which isn't a very satisfying conclusion. But at any rate, for the sense of personal continuity, we do want to have certain things which don't change, and other things which do. And I'm not sure we always know what, I'm not sure we would always make the right decisions about what to put in that box.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, how do we know which values to lock in and which values we should allow to evolve? Which premises, which principles we want to latch onto? Let's just say we said we just want to be blissful, and then society evolves, and we find that we just bliss isn't the only thing we should value. We should value novelty. We should value variety of experience. We should value personal connection with other people or other minds or other agents. So yeah, I mean, it makes sense. So some of the core things that I think about that I'd like to build into a digital version of me or a digital twin of me would be epistemic humility. So the ability to change when it's warranted, not so much that I'm changing my mind at any sort of breeze in any different direction. Another one would be care.
A version of myself that had epistemic humility. Since I do not have it myself, but
you do not. Oh, come on, you got to have a little bit. I'm surely you've changed your mind over the years. You have about AI. I remember you saying that this AI is just a dream of sort of religious sort of fanaticism or something like that. You didn't say that, but something along those lines is what I remember.
No, you
right. have changed your minds. You have changed your mind, which is good.
Reality slapped me upside the head.
And you had to change your mind, right? Yeah. So, and the other one, I guess, epistemic humility, care, and what's another thing that I would want to have built in premises? Care, epistemic humility. I forget. Yeah, there's probably one other thing. But anyway, what I just want to know what are the main principles that you would think would be foundational to the kind of person you would like to have in the future, representing you.
Okay, I'm going to take it back to Buddhism, which is that since you are an illusion in the first place, the goal is to see through that illusion to the point where the idea of personal continuity becomes irrelevant, right? And so imagine, you've lived 1,000 years and you've had 1,000 years of experiences and you're this post-human being, but everything about you could be recorded on, some recording media because you're now a digital, mostly a digital person. Wouldn't it make sense that you would want to just pass that into perpetuity? Why you wouldn't necessarily need to be conscious anymore. You could just have yourself be a part of the perpetual knowledge of the rest of the human race. I think that's what we all want. We want to be remembered, right? It's not necessarily that we need to personally persist for thousands of years, but we do want to be remembered. And for me, that's the point. I would like to live long enough that I'm actually ready to dissolve the self and to just let it go into the great library. Yeah,
that's interesting. I guess if it was just a great library, I mean, would you mind if like books became sentient in a sense? Like, would that be an issue if we have a library of sentient literature? Would that be a moral issue with you?
We're 10 minutes away from that. I mean, you've the Notebook LM architecture, which you drop a couple PDFs into and it turns it into a podcast. You know, I think we could probably talk to books in the future. I mean, unfortunately,
Yeah, but that's talking to books. But what about books that feel
books that actually
and have experience?
Well, would you want the book to feel, or would you want the characters to come alive? I think one of the interesting possibilities.
Society of mind.
Yeah, I mean, the kid, by the way, who killed himself using character AI, he was talking to Daenerys Targaryen, his girlfriend. He was a 15-year-old, but you know he had this semi-erotic relationship with the chatbot, and he had named her Daenerys Targaryen. So I think many people probably would want to have relationships with their fan idols or their favorite character in a novel.
Mm-hmm. I'm not sure of this story. Somebody who committed suicide as part of the news. I didn't reach me. What happened?
A 15-year-old. Well, Character AI is a company that spun off of Google and then was just reacquired by Google. That was specifically designed to give people the opportunity to create different personas to have as friends and confidants. There was also an erotic component that you could add to all of that, and many men found attractive, but also women. So this kid got on, 15-year-old, and he developed a very intense emotional relationship with his chatbot called Daenerys, that he called Daenerys Targaryen, and eventually was so depressed that he killed himself. But in this case, the chatbot really didn't contribute, in my opinion, to his killing himself. It's not like the chatbot said, hey, why don't you go kill yourself, or ignore necessarily the fact that he was unhappy. It tried to talk to him, but it wasn't, it was an obsession that people considered contributory to his depression and his eventual suicide. And from a moral enhancement point of view, we do want chatbots to recognize depressive symptoms and suicidal ideation in a conversation and have a conversation with you about that. It's like, hey, are you going to kill yourself? Because if you are, I really think you should do this instead. And it didn't do that. So at any rate, there's a pending lawsuit about it. We'll see what happens.
Mm-hmm. Would you want people to go in and edit? Let's just say your relatives thought that they didn't like a certain part of your arguments for X, Y, and Z, right? Would you be happy with them going in and editing your digital twin after you die?
Apparently, according to Stefan Sorgner, the idea that Nietzsche was not really a Nazi and that his sister made him into a Nazi by selectively editing his works is not entirely true. But that was the idea for a long time, that, the only reason that the Nazis thought that Nietzsche was on their side was because of heavy editing by his sister of his work. Mm-hmm. I think that might be part of what we put into our codicil when we die about how to deal with our digital assets. It's like, you can do this with it, but you can't do this with it. You can't turn me into a Nazi because I'm not. So, I do think that should be a concern. But on the other hand, as we already discussed, we change over time. We change our mind fundamentally about things over time. So we also should give thought to allowing them to change as they converse with others. Like, if you were too much of a jerk to accept your gay kid when you were alive, but your LLM eventually comes around, I think that's victory. Hallelujah. But on the other hand, if it becomes an evangelical Christian and tells your kid to go kill themselves, then that's a problem too.
Mm. I mean, like, let's just say, I suppose I'd be okay if my digital twin could be persuaded through argument. And let's just say my digital twin was way smarter than I could be and had access to the world's sort of knowledge. I mean, if you're digitized, I mean, you could really just almost like surgically implant knowledge in your brain. Like you can, I guess AI might be able to do this as well in the future. And, download how to learn Kung Fu like Neo does. So maybe my future self will be a kung fu expert. I don't know. But like, let's just say it started implanting ideology and all those sorts of things. I guess the first question is, would your digital, you would be okay with your digital twin being okay with persuaded by good arguments, that is evidence and good rational reasons for X, Y, and Z? And would you be okay with your digital twin having knowledge implanted in your digital twin's brain without the learning process that we normally naturally undergo?
I would, but let me rewind to the idea of the exocortex. That I think from an extended mind point of view, having something having AI in your glasses that talks to you and does things for you is as good as having it as a brain computer interface, right? So, if in terms of language, we already are at the point where you can have glasses that hear spoken language and translate it into text in your eyes and could tell you the translation in real time. Would anybody then go through the trouble of learning Chinese or whatever if they had those capabilities? That kind of cognitive offloading might mean less Chinese language study, but it might mean a lot more conversation between English and Chinese speakers. So I think there's a comparative benefit there. But yeah, I'm not terribly concerned about that kind of offloading.
Okay. So what if there were like a vast swathes of philosophical literature on ethics and values implanted in your digital twin's brains that caused you to have a sort of a value shift, not necessarily random drift, but there was some form of, I guess, meta ethical and metaphysical assumptions that you hold now that had to be overturned based on new knowledge that your future digital twin then had direct access to. Would that be a concern?
There's research on the political and value biases of LLMs. I wouldn't say that they're terribly coherent yet. The LLM's biases, but they do exhibit, when you ask them different kinds of opinions, they do exhibit a generally left liberal California kind of version of reality. And I'm very curious to see when DeepSeek becomes better studied. We don't really understand everything that DeepSeek is doing yet, but DeepSeek was trained on an entirely, not entirely different, but it included Chinese literature in a way that the training of the Silicon Valley models didn't, my understanding. And as a consequence, not only that, but it's also under the CCP's ideological regime. I don't know how deep it's gone, whether it truly expresses socialist values or not, but it definitely won't talk to you about Tiananmen Square. But the idea that that LLMs might have intrinsic ideological points of view based on the training data and the red teaming and the other things that we do with them, I think that that's well accepted now. They do. I think they're also easily modifiable. I mean, DeepSeek, as soon as it was released open source, people jailbroke it so that it would talk about Tiananmen Square. And it actually knew about Tiananmen Square. It knew everything that we wanted to know about Tiananmen Square. But it's just that it would get to a certain point in the reasoning process where the CCP thing would kick in and it would say, oh, well, rewind that. I can't talk about that topic. So we were able to jailbreak it, right? Now, I think some people naively assumed that if an LLM that knows, a trillion things about the world has an opinion about something, that opinion is better reflective of reality. And I think a lot of people are going to have those kinds of assumptions. I think it'll become pretty clear pretty quickly that this LLM has this opinion and this one has a different opinion because of the way they're trained and the people they're using. Not only that, but that the LLM is going to be responsive to you, and whatever your opinion is the opinion it's going to adopt, right? Because it's a preference engine in some ways, especially with market forces. So, yeah, I think I forget what your original question was, but the idea of LLMs as kind of moral guides for humanity, I don't think that that's as plausible as the idea that they're going to become perfect reflections of your biases and ideological views.
Well, yeah, that's interesting. I'm not sure why the LLMs favor liberal left. Now, it could have been just because lots of prompting favors the left side of the political spectrum. There's a lot of literature out there written about those values, maybe more than there is on the right. The other thing is maybe some of the left premises are more coherent in with each other and such that they, there's something going on in the LLM which finds values and tries to find coherences between them, or principles and finds coherences between them in order to emerge values from. Now, I spoke earlier yesterday about Dan Hendricks's findings that it does seem as though as LLMs scale in size, there's more coherent value systems emerging in them, but also they have the tendency to maximize based on these values without much humility, and also that they exhibit biases, left-leaning political biases. Also, they can exhibit biases in valuing some humans more than others, and also valuing themselves more than humans in some circumstances, and also be incorrigible to change. Right? If we try and steer them to change, it's hard. Right?
From an ethical point of view, the finding in that paper that it valued the lives of Pakistanis and people in the developing world in general more than the people in the developed world was like very eye-opening for me. It's like, what was it reading that it came to the conclusion that, one Nigerian is worth 3 Americans or whatever?
Well, whatever it was. But look, there's been assumptions, and like I saw in the Twitter thread that followed, that it could be down to the cost of aid to help people in the poorer countries compared to the cost of aid to help people in the richer countries. The people in the poorer countries are often worse off than people in the rich countries, so they perhaps don't need as much help now as people in the richer countries. Yeah. So that could be a contributing factor. The other thing is, I don't think LLMs are just glorified lookup tables. I think there is some form of reasoning going on behind the scenes there. I don't know how it works, but this grokking phenomena is something that's been observed. I haven't read about it more recently, but it certainly was observed in toy examples. In the early 2020s. Yeah, so that's interesting. Another interesting piece was that somebody recognized that if you train an LLM to do one thing bad in a narrow way, it then generalizes badness. You train an LLM to give insecure code examples to people asking for code, then it starts sprouting Nazi literature and starts being mean in other ways as well. So badness can generalize, you train it to do something bad and then it ends up being evil in other ways, which I thought was actually horrifying. Also a little bit funny, but
we just put Grok in charge of the U.S. government, so we'll see what happens.
Right. Yeah. All right. So what moral obligations, in general, do you think people should be considering, giving to their after selves or these, digital twins?
What moral obligations?
Yeah. Should they be moral patients forever, or should they be moral actors? Would you like your after self to be a moral actor? I'd actually start there.
Well, you to be a moral actor, I do think from my philosophical point of view, you need moral standing. Moral standing should come with consciousness, self, personhood, etc.
But that's just the same as a patient.
Right. Well, but yes. So to have patiency, to actually be a subject of moral concern, it requires the same things as to be an actor, a moral actor in the world. You have to be a self-aware being. But I think David Gunkel has argued convincingly that the way we actually think about these things is that we have relationships to things. It's not about, we're not constantly calculating the moral standing of things. We're actually relating to them in some way. And so that the relationships that we will develop with digital twins will imbue them with relational authenticity as a moral person, even if we know intellectually that they don't have the moral status. Now, I think there should still be a legal difference. I think it should be illegal to torture a sentient machine, but not illegal to do reinforcement learning experimentation to train your LLM. That's not torturing your machine. But we have to figure out what it would mean to torture a machine, and that should be illegal. Even though you may relate to a non-sentient machine as if it's something that shouldn't be tortured. And we've already seen this at MIT Media Lab. Famously, you hold the robot dinosaur upside down and it says, "Stop, stop, stop." And then you ask, the participant to smash it with a hammer, and they refuse to because it's obviously sentient because it said stop. These kinds of experiments, we already see that this is happening in the world. It's a moral problem in that we may be misattributing moral standing to things that don't have them, but it's also just the reality of how it's going to develop.
I'm just trying to find questions in the audience. So LLMs are more morally consistent than humans? Someone asked from the audience. Well, maybe in some cases.
I don't know if that's the case yet, but I think they definitely could be. I mean, if you wanted an LM to be a moral exemplar of some kind, or to take a moral stance, it definitely would be a more consistent one than most human beings are. I was just at a conference at Harvard today, and we were talking about what it means to train a moral machine. I've always been very influenced by Cullen Allen and Wendell Wallach's book, Moral Machines. And
yeah.
The way that they, The way that they break it down, the argument is to say, well, how do we ordinary people actually think about the morality of situations? And we learn moral cases over time. We learned the Terry Schiavo case. This is how bioethics is taught. You learn a series of cases and you analyze in depth all the moral salient features of the case. And you're not just looking at it from one ethical point of view, a consistent, consequentialist point of view, or consistent deontological or virtue, whatever. You look at it. Here's all the different things that people could be ethically concerned about for very different reasons in these situations. And once you have that kind of moral literacy, then every new situation that you see, you can apply those principles. I think machines are going to be very good at that. But that doesn't imply moral consistency in the sense of having one philosophical view that you a priori judge everything by. Like one situation might be about rules, and one situation might be about a person's intention, and another situation might be about the long-term consequences. And those are three different kinds of calculation, and we'll have to figure out when to apply those different moral logics. And the machine might be very good at that too.
Yes, exactly, and it could be the case that machines find consistently better ways of appropriately using different forms of, moral inquiry to deal with different situations. Whether, we with our limited cognitive capacity stumble perhaps in these sorts of areas. I've got to review that book. That's a really good book. Cullen Allen and Wendell Wallach's Moral Machines. I'd love to get you guys on a panel together. Do you know Wendell Wallach very much? Is he still active?
He's a fellow of the IET.
Yeah. And Cullen Allen, is he still about?
I think he's still a professor, University of Washington. I forget exactly where.
Right. Cool. Yeah. Let's see what else. I think people are asking, learning is fun, but the process of studying is not. Does that matter if does that mean if someone tries to use LLMs to be authoritarian, it'll likely backfire, as the LLM itself would want to be authoritarian to the dictator itself?
Well, that's an interesting question about the risks to regimes from artificial intelligent AGIs or whatever. I don't think very many people are worrying about that right now. They're more interested in how you can use these tools to further the ends of the state or the regime. But yeah, I would be worried that that's the classic scenario. What's the movie Colossus? I think from 1964, which imagined an American supercomputer that ran our defense industry and a Russian supercomputer that ran theirs, and they get together and they decide to take over the world because the goals that they've been given by humans were stupid and were better served by them taking over the world. And that has been the theme of many, many, many science fiction movies and books since then. But I think there is a concern there, right? That a machine could have goals of its own, or it could have misaligned goals so that it decides to dismantle a regime that thought it was going to use that for authoritarian purposes.
Now, from a Buddhist point of view, these death pots or afterselves could essentially be immortal, right? Are you worried about them being caught in some samsara? Like, never be able to leave the wheel of life?
Well, one of the more distressing novels that Ian Banks wrote in the culture universe was about a society that decided to do the Roko's Bass it decided to punish people for the sins while they were alive by creating digital simulacrum of them that would be punished eternally in the digital world. And of course, in the digital world, you could make every second a million years. So and you could crank up the suffering to extents that a human being wouldn't be able to bear. So I think we definitely don't want that to happen. I don't see very many people worrying about that eventuality right now, but that will be part of your codicil about how your digital simulacra should be treated in the future.
Mm-hmm.
But again,
Yes.
that presumes that it could be a sentient being at some point, which I think it probably could be.
Yeah, Black Mirror also had an episode, White Christmas, if I remember correctly, where yes, people.
Colossus was 70s, I guess. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought it was 64. My science fiction erudition is failing.
Yeah. Would you want if you're a Buddhist, would you want your death bot to continue on the crusade to liberate people from suffering and liberate people from samsara?
Wouldn't that be lovely? I mean, knowing my own limitations, if I could, I'll give you another science fiction example. Ken McLeod, his novel The Star Faction, has a Trotskyist AI that lives in the barrel of a gun that leads a global revolution. I don't think that one started as an upload, but you could imagine it starting as an upload. But yeah, I think the idea of your personal agency continuing into the future in order to try to pursue the ethical or goals that you had, protecting your family. I mean, I think you've seen this a million times in science fiction. The ancient ancestor who uploaded themselves and looks over the family and guides it, the monarchy or whatever it is, guides it through time. That idea has some appeal to me that I could contribute in some way. I don't think that, my digital simulacrum is going to be anywhere close to being smart enough to participate in the future post-human society, unless somebody's very, very generous. But yeah, if I could, I would.
Mm-hmm. What about copies? Would you worry that multiple copies of your simulacrum be allowed to be made?
Well, you and I know Robin Hanson. Did he already talk today, Robin?
Yeah, he did. Yep.
So yeah, he imagines this future in which we, the Severance. This may be where Severance, the TV show, is headed. That creating the perfect worker, but that uploads would become that you could upload one worker who does something really, really well and make 1 million copies of them, or that you could make 1 million copies of yourself in a digital form. And then the question is, legally, what's your relationship to all of them? Are they all your children? Do they all inherit your wife and your kids? I mean, I don't know that we know the answer to these relationships yet. And if they're not sentient, it's not really a significant issue for me. But as soon as they actually did become sentient, if you're actually creating multiple sentient copies of yourself, I think it is morally like having children.
Mm-hmm. What about governance then? Do you think that they should be governed in the same way as normal people if they're sentient? Should they have rights in the same way as normal people? Should they be recognized as having rights? Should they own property? Should they compete against your ancestors? Descendants.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Should we have
That's
a
interesting.
preference for yeah, should we have a preference for our biological descendants over our digital ones? That's an interesting question. I'll leave it to the science fiction authors. I don't know if I've given enough thought yet about whether I want to put my thumb on the scale for my actual biological progeny or not. I don't know how long we're going to have biological progeny. Well, I mean, most of the world seems to be deciding not to have kids, so maybe we're only going to have digital progeny in the future. That'll be the solution.
Yeah, yeah. I imagine that, like if they could replicate and then compete against your descendants and everybody else, then who knows? It could be a really, really interesting future. I'd rather a less interesting future where everybody just cooperates.
I do. I think the impact on democracy of this comment from Jeremy, a million goose-stepping Musk copies, then you give them all a vote. I think that's a dystopian outcome, right? That if we were to give moral standing, much less political empowerment and suffrage, to digital copies because they had reached some sentience threshold, it would have this immediate distorting effect on how we understand, democracy. That would be problematic.
Hmm.
Not that I don't think that they should be a part of democracy, but I just don't know. We might want to. I think this was actually a part of Cadre's work. Anyway, the idea that you could have a future in which you could have a digital copy, but you can only have one at a time. I think that that's an understandable legal requirement that we might put on future creations of digital copies.
In the past, we've sort of looked to the elders to impart wisdom and to teach, the youngsters sort of good tricks, and, how to cooperate, how to survive better, and what mistakes to avoid. Do you think like the future after cells, digital twins, death bots, or whatever they're called, like should they play the role of moral advisors?
Well, people when they pray to their ancestors, I think that's one of the things that probably happens is that they, ask for intercessory help and advice. I don't know how many Chinese or Koreans or Japanese actually feel like they're having a conversation with their ancestors, but traditional animism would suggest that yes, you would ask for advice and help from the gods that you pray to. In this case, it would be a lot more, effective because they would know a lot and they would have a lot to say, and you could actually have a conversation with them. So yeah, I do think that they would, but when I go back, I went to a period of deep dive into my family history until I realized that family history is as illusory a reality as anything else. If you start, I'll just digress on this for 1 second. If you start going back about 300 years because of misattributed paternity in your family line, you actually have no idea who your grandparents were. That if 5% of all births it was actually this guy instead of this guy. You do that multiple generations after 300 years, you have no idea. So, okay, what was the original question? Because I got caught in the distraction.
How should they be moral advisors?
Yeah, how should they be moral advisors? When I go back through my family history, I've got some really colorful ancestors, but I don't think I want any of them to give me advice because, they lived in such radically different times, and they probably would have no sympathy for my situation and moral choices today, right? It's like, they wouldn't understand anything about the modern world. So you could have an interesting, and this is a part of the thing. Maybe part of what they should do is be able to update and reflect, what a 16th century person would say once they had gotten used to the 21st century. But yeah, I don't think many people are going to be going to their great grandparents for moral advice.
Maybe not nowadays. I guess they used to. Yeah, people used to, like in the Eastern cultures. I think it's probably they're more maybe they used to be more that way. If it's not
Wait,
already obvious.
Margaret Mead was the one who invented the term generation gap, and she invented it to describe the phenomenon that as society changes more rapidly, you have less and less to learn from your parents. And I think that that's probably going to just continue in the future. Um, you may have the 13-year-olds may have nothing to learn from the 16-year-olds in the future because things are changing so fast. We'll just have to see.
Okay, so I'm putting on my extra wildly speculative cap on now. What about after selves for hive minds, right? Let's just say organisms, should they have after selves? Whole populations, should they have after selves? Like, let's just say America goes down in flames. Do we want an after self for America?
I think hive minds are a possibility. Our current project at UMass Boston with the IET team here, we have a postdoc who's working on brain-computer interfaces. And I think one of the things that brain-computer interfaces portend is the possibility of digital telepathy, being able to communicate with other people. We would have to have a currently unimaginable architecture in the brain in order to really decode mental language, thoughts, feelings, and so on, and transmit them in any way. But I think we're on a trajectory to achieve that, and to have a level of mental telepathy that would begin to break down the barriers of the self in the way that the Borg kind of imagined. Why people would do it, I'm not sure many people would feel attracted to that, although it could be a form of letting go and ego death and contributing to the greater cause. You might do it because it's your political party or your church or whatever. And so or a cult. I mean, we've definitely seen these kinds of abnegations of self in cults. So I think we will see phenomenon of people using neurotechnologies to suppress the self or to create a group self. And I'm not sure that it should be illegal. But it is one of those things where I would like there to be, like when you change the screen settings on your computer, it says, is this really what you want? You have 10 seconds to go back. Or if you have 10 seconds to say yes, or else it'll go back to what it was before, in the case you can't see anything on your screen. And I think we might want to have that for these kinds of radical changes of self, to say, is this really what you want to do? Or is this experience bad?
Okay, there's been a few more questions in the chat that I didn't see. Wikipedia says James is on the advisory council of the Christian Transhumanist Association.
Well, there isn't a Buddhist one, so I had to join something, right? There isn't a Buddhist transhumanist.
So you converted to Christianity, did you?
The Mormons never asked. The Mormon transhumanists are the most well-organized transhumanists in the world, and they never asked, although I'm good friends with them. But the Christians asked, and I said yes. So what do I got to lose? Maybe I'll get into heaven.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that's another thing. Would you want your digital after self be converted to another ideology by other evangelical after selves?
Well, just to perseverate on this question of my religiosity, I'm not even sure I'm a Buddhist anymore, because some people would say that there are certain prerequisites for being a Buddhist, like believing in reincarnation. I don't believe in reincarnation, although what we're talking about is basically a form of reincarnation, right? Digital reincarnation. But I think there's a general point in our futurism that if you extrapolate technological possibility far enough, it becomes religious, right? That I am sure that all the major religions of the world will begin to accommodate to our technological future and begin to do the kinds of things that the Mormon transhumanists have done, which is to say, hey, this idea in transhumanism seems exactly like something Joseph Smith was talking about, 180 years ago, and reinterpret in a technological guise some of the spirituality. When I was at Harvard Divinity School today, they were talking about whether building AI gods is one of the things that people are trying to do or should be trying to do, or whether it's a terrible idea. Of course, the religious people there didn't think building an AI god was a good idea. But I think it's quite possible that we'll see new forms of religiosity that are convergent between existing faiths and technological possibility, and that those would be things that would be more plausible to me, right, in the future. If, like Taylor de Chardin's understanding of what Christianity's end goal is, to merge individuals with the new sphere. I think his understanding of the Christian mission is one that I wouldn't necessarily have a problem with. It seems plausible.
Yeah. It's really interesting. It's been a long time since I looked at that, but
yeah, when the Mormons, by the way, one of the things that I really love about the Mormons is that they invented genealogy, and they invented it in order to baptize the dead. This opens another dystopian possibility of Mormons not only baptizing, but resurrecting in various guises their dead ancestors in order to baptize them. They wouldn't have any information about 99.9% of them, but yeah, you could imagine people trying to do that.
do you imagine, like, if we did an after self of John Stuart Mill, would he reconsider his views on women's rights in the modern age? Do you think that should be permissible, that he should be allowed to do that in the first place, I guess?
I mean, you can already have that conversation with, I think I opened with the example of, I'd never written about blockchain, but the LLMs said, hey, this is what you should probably think about blockchain based on everything else you think. And I've had those kind of conversations about other philosophical thinkers. It's like, Marx never talked about this particular thing, but what would Marx think of it today? And the LLM is creative enough to come up with answers, and probably better and better. I think that's fine. But would it be different if it was the Marx LLM and you suddenly changed it to update it to have being a 21st century post-capitalist? Yeah, that would probably be a violation of the underlying authenticity of the Marx.
If there's any concluding points that you want to make at this time?
I mean, my worry about all this is that the future is so unpredictable, and as you pointed out, I used to not be as concerned. I never denied any of the things that we're talking about. I always thought neurotechnology, artificial intelligence, mind melds, digital agents were eventually going to come. But given the progress that had been made by the 2000s and the cultish behavior of the singularitarians, who were, in retrospect, Cassandras about these things, as opposed to just being delusional, but they seemed like an apocalyptic or millennialist cult of some kind, that I didn't pay as much attention to that as I did to the human enhancement side of things. And if you go back to the original Singularity paper that Vinci wrote about the singularity and artificial intelligence becoming smarter than humans, he said the only way that we can stop the bad things that might come from an artificial intelligence singularity is through intelligence augmentation and augmenting our own intelligence. And so I've always been more convinced that that's the focus that we should have, as opposed to completely creating autonomous robots out there, is to try to augment our own human agency in various ways. So that's my final thought, is that I think that these digital agents are ways that we could use the tools of artificial intelligence to augment individual human agency, as opposed to replace humans altogether.
Cool. Awesome. Well, it's been wonderful having you again, James, and thanks so much for participating in Future Day.
And thanks to the audience. Good questions.
Yes, indeed.